This is Andy, this is Tiffany, and then this is my speaking outline. You've bought a fair lane, but you will find its settlement dark and bloody. Dragging Canoe, the Chickamauga leader, said this. The Trail of Tears impacted our country from the beginning, starting with the Native Americans being forced out of their homeland by American settlers. Have you ever heard the statement, history repeats itself? We need to know the mistakes made in history so that we don't repeat it later on. The Trail of Tears impacted our country from the day it started. On May 28th, 1830, Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, signed the Indian Removal Act, therefore beginning the Trail of Tears. First, we need to get some background information on why the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears were thought to be a thing. In the early 1800s, once Americans began to explore new land and expand our country, they found conflict with the Native American people. The Native American people had their own set ways, and they didn't want white English influence in their land. They wanted their strict settlements to be theirs with their rules and their guidelines. The early American people saw the Native Americans and thought they could try to civilize the Native Americans to make them more modern, more European in their ways and teachings. The Native Americans did not like that the American people came in and tried to take over. They felt it as an attack and began to start fighting. Conflict struck more and the fighting began between the white people and the Native Americans. The government recognized the problem and realized that they wanted to create a solution so that their people could have the land and that the conflict would stop. They were hoping for peaceful resolutions, but that didn't happen. Now that we have some background information, we want to know about the laws and the impacts on how it actually began. The Native American Removal Act was the law that began the Trail of Tears. According to the Library of Congress website, the Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830, authorizing the president to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. A few tribes went peacefully, but many resisted the relocation policy, thus beginning the fighting and ending the peaceful resolutions. The governmental power tried to come in and take the lands from the Native Americans. They began to try to force them out of their homelands and relocate them west of the Mississippi River and out of the eastern portion of the United States. They ended without peaceful negotiations. The Native Americans forced and pushed to try to stay in their lands east of the Mississippi River and not be forced westward. Now that we have some background information and the laws that enacted it, we should talk about the actual event of the Trail of Tears. The invasion lasted from 1837 to 1839. It was caused by threat of the U.S. Army. When the peaceful negotiations stopped and the beginning of threats began, the U.S. sent in their military forces to try to move the Native Americans out, which was intense fighting and ended not peacefully. The Native Americans began walking, and it was very cold, and they struggled with the temperatures. According to the book by Sue Vanderhook, at least 3,000 people died due to the harsh conditions and the walking for days and months at a time. This is according to the Office of the Historian website, except for a small number of Seminoles residing in Florida. By the 1840s, the Atlantic to Mississippi, no Indian tribes resided except for the Seminoles in the American South. Since we know what happened during the Trail of Tears and the events that happened, it is time to hear about how it's been impacting the government and the U.S. to this day. the Native Americans are still being talked about according to the History Channel. The ways of how the Americans in the 1800s forced out the Native Americans is still being discussed, and laws are still being disclosed today by the American government. The Supreme Court made a decision in 2020 that Oklahoma will become an Indian reserve for certain parts of the state. They also decided in 2022 to retract that and to try to come up with a new solution as to how the American Indian culture can be preserved, which was all caused by the 1800s. Now that we've heard the impact of the Trail of Tears and how it was so impactful on our country even to this day, we've also learned how important it is to know about the history so that we can avoid the events in our future. The Trail of Tears caused much commotion and heartbreak in our country and led to the death of thousands of people. This was a big turning point for the United States in its early days because it showed governmental force that can do a lot, even cause death. The process of Indian removal lasted almost a decade and is still having impacts on our country 2 centuries later. I hope that you go out and try a little to change, because change begins with you. So go out and try to learn some more about the history of our country so that it doesn't happen in the future. And just try to make an impact. And then this is Tiffany again and Andy.